In the early 20th century economics, John Maynard Keynes was a legendary figure. He was not only an outstanding economist but also an exceptional investor. His investment journey was filled with ups and downs, from a speculative trader to a prudent value investor. Keynes' investment path is full of stories and insights. Some have described Keynes this way: in times of prosperity, he is forgotten. In times of crisis, people remember Keynes. When we, as mere readers, delve into Keynes's works, we are often impressed by his eloquent and grandiloquent writing style and bewildered by his ever-changing positions. However, when we look at the world today and revisit the various disasters and setbacks of the 20th century, we find it difficult to bypass this seemingly wavering economist in understanding the secrets that connect the past and present. John M. Keynes was born into an upper-middle-class family in Cambridge. His father was a lecturer in economics and moral sciences at the University of Cambridge. He was a bright scholar who received a scholarship to Eton College. After graduating from Eton College, he studied mathematics at King's College, Cambridge. At Cambridge, the great economist Alfred Marshall encouraged Keynes to study the relatively new field of economics. Keynes published his first economic article in 1909 and became the editor of the Economic Journal in 1911. During World War I, Keynes served as a government advisor. He helped negotiate terms with British creditors. British debt had surged during World War I. At the end of World War I, Keynes participated in the Versailles Treaty as a member of the British delegation. Keynes was shocked by the level of reparations that the Allies wanted to impose on Germany. Keynes resigned from the British delegation, calling it a recipe for German bankruptcy. In 1919, he wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace, accurately predicting the difficulties Germany would face and the political discontent that would follow severe peace terms. In the 1920s, Keynes strongly criticized the British decision to return to the gold standard of 1914. Keynes believed that artificially raising the exchange rate of the pound would make life difficult for British exporters. The decision to return to the gold standard in 1925 was widely blamed for the long-term deflation and high unemployment experienced in the 1920s. Winston Churchill, the Chancellor of the Exchequer responsible for this decision, later admitted that it was the biggest domestic mistake of his career. The Great Depression of 1929–39 provided Keynes with an opportunity to challenge the dominant classical orthodox ideas that prevailed in economic theory at the time. When the Great Depression struck, the classical response was to rely on free markets and balanced budgets through taxation and government expenditure cuts. In 1931, Keynes particularly criticized the contractionary budget of Ramsay MacDonald's government, which cut public investment, wages, and raised taxes. Keynes believed that the government should do the opposite. Throughout the 1930s, Keynes advocated increasing government expenditure by borrowing. However, in most democratic countries, apart from intermittent spending as part of the New Deal, his ideas remained a lonely voice. The basic principle of Keynes's work was that during economic downturns, resources are wasted due to an increase in private savings and a decrease in private sector investment and spending. Therefore, government intervention is needed. The government should borrow money from the surplus savings of the private sector to help utilize idle resources. Keynes was also a brilliant advocate of his views, with a knack for capturing attention. For example, when he saw a waiter doing nothing, he deliberately spilled some napkins on the floor. He explained to his puzzled friends that he was trying to prevent unemployment by creating job opportunities. In his general theory, he used the analogy of digging holes in the ground to explain the concept of aggregate demand. His work created some famous phrases. He popularized the idea of the paradox of thrift. He also coined the phrase, "In the long run, we are all dead." This phrase was a satirical critique of classical theory, which argued that in the long run, markets would eventually return to equilibrium. His groundbreaking work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, provided a framework for macroeconomics and departed significantly from the more limited classical framework. After the war, Western governments adopted varying degrees of Keynesian demand management, aiming for full employment. This led U.S. President Nixon to declare in the 1960s, "We are all Keynesians now." In the 1970s, Keynes's work came under challenge due to the stagflation of that decade and responses from new classical economists and monetarists like Milton Friedman. However, The Great Recession of 2008 to 2013 renewed interest in Keynes's explanations for long-term economic downturns. In 1940, his health began to deteriorate, and he had to reduce his workload. However, after World War II, he was asked to participate in negotiations between the UK and the US on debt repayment. Keynes's job was to impress upon the Americans how bankrupt Britain was. The American delegation that met Keynes was deeply impressed by his wisdom and enthusiasm. Although they did not agree to extend credit terms until Congress began to worry about the spread of communism in Europe, they eventually met his demands. In addition to economics, Keynes had a passion for the arts and opera, and he was known for his extraordinary intellect. He was a formidable intellect, and even critics acknowledged his greatness and persuasiveness. Another quality of Keynes was his optimism and belief in finding solutions. While many were despairing of the social and economic costs of the Great Depression, Keynes saw a way out. Things didn't have to be this way. Keynes's investment journey was not without its challenges. In 1920, using his knowledge of international finance, Keynes entered the currency markets, believing he had more brains. He speculated that post-war inflation would lead to the depreciation of the French franc, German mark, and Italian lira, so he went short on them. He held long positions in the Indian rupee, Norwegian and Danish krone, and the US dollar. In the initial months, he and his partners in the hedge fund he co-founded made a net profit of $30,000, followed by another $80,000. Given that most European countries were essentially bankrupt due to the war at the time, this was an astronomical sum. However, just 4 weeks later, optimism about Germany caused European currencies to rebound, wiping out all their funds. Keynes later made a comeback with the help of family and friends. As an economist deeply convinced that he could quantify the impact of supply and demand curves, Keynes became obsessed with commodity trading. His net assets exceeded $3.4 million in 1927, but after the stock market crash of 1929, his net worth plummeted by 80%, forcing him to consider selling some of his art, which he ultimately did not sell. In 1930, Keynes's commodity holdings were almost wiped out. A student of Keynes named Seligman Cook, who he had taught, was the deputy director of the National Mutual Life Assurance Society and went bankrupt in mid-1930, shooting himself in July. However, Keynes did not give up. He learned from his failures and gradually realized the complexity and uncertainty of market trends. He understood that relying too much on predictions and speculative trading could lead to disaster, whereas informed investors who did their homework had the opportunity. In the early 1930s, Keynes began to shift his investment strategy. He transitioned from speculative trading to value investing, becoming a bottom-up stock picker. He believed that through in-depth research and analysis, he could find stocks with potential, and their value would be reflected in the market. After a series of market crashes in the 1930s, Keynes no longer believed that his macroeconomic theory could predict the emotions of large-scale investors. Keynes abandoned currency and commodity trading and turned to investing in stocks in the 1930s, eventually amassing wealth, which undoubtedly required great courage. In the face of one of the most severe sell-offs in 1929, Keynes actually became a contrarian investor. Instead of jumping on lifeboats, he stayed on the storm-ridden ship. He believed that deflation could bring about lower interest rates, from which investors could benefit. Although his commodity positions were devastated, he believed that stocks not only preserved value but also rebounded. Having such thoughts in the circumstances of 1931 required considerable courage, and this established Keynes as a pioneer in fund management and an inspiration to future investors. During 1932 to 1937, few realized that this period was the second largest price rally of the 20th century, following the prosperity of 1921 to 1929. The stock market rebounded nearly 280% during the 1930s rebound period. Keynes survived the entire 1930s in the market, but he experienced punishing losses from 1937 through the World War II. From 1942 to 1946, there was another incredible counterintuitive wave. Germany was bombing London, hundreds of British ships sank, and the situation in Europe remained dire until the Normandy landings in 1944. However, Keynes stuck to his investment portfolio during this period, during which U.S. stocks rose by 122%. Throughout the 1930s and World War II, Keynes held onto carefully selected stocks that represented almost every significant component of the economy. If he had sold these stocks during times of crisis, he would have received poor returns. There were two little-known price rebounds during the seemingly worst times, constituting the largest part of Keynes's total return. Keynes transformed into a long-term investor. He said in a memo to the directors of the National Mutual Life Assurance Company, "If we attempt to get out, we shall find it hard to get back in again. We shall miss the recovery and be left behind. If the recovery never comes, what does it matter?" After 1934, Keynes eventually became a bottom-up and concentrated value investor. In the early 1930s, Keynes favored buying large company stocks at cheap prices, which laid the foundation for the entire value investing school. In 1936, nearly 66% of the assets in the King's College portfolio managed by Keynes were mining stocks. This investment strategy, known as concentrated investing, involves holding only a few stocks, as opposed to widespread diversification or index portfolios. Keynes's investment portfolio generated significant returns over the following decades. His annualized return was 15.21%, far surpassing the annualized return of the British stock index at the time. His portfolio not only survived the stock market crash of the 1930s but also thrived during World War II. Keynes eventually realized that market trends were highly uncertain due to the existence of the animal spirits, unquantifiable uncertainty that is the enemy of speculators but offers buying opportunities for knowledgeable investors. In the early 1930s, Keynes transformed from a speculator into a bottom-up stock picker. He said, "I gradually came to believe that the right method in investment is to put fairly large sums into enterprises which one thinks one knows something about and in the management of which one thoroughly believes. It is a mistake to think that one limits one's risk by spreading too much between enterprises about which one knows little and has no reason for special confidence." In 1946, while helping implement post-war economic solutions and establishing the Bretton Woods system, he tragically passed away due to